Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about um, Photoshop and curves. And I want to start here where when we're thinking about, okay, here's a curve in Photoshop and, what do we do with this? We talked a little bit about doing some basics, um, but let's talk about specifics about how this whole thing works. So curves really is more precise than levels because it can be used to affect a specific subset of the image's tonal range by setting points on a curve to further constrain where those are. Now, when we first start off in Photoshop, we get this diagonal line, and there's only 2 points, one at the bottom left and one at the top right. But I want to take a closer look at this because really what it is a graph. And really what we're doing is we're remapping the tonal range as it currently is in the image into a slightly different one, what we want it to be, hopefully. So we talked about how the basic use of curves is to increase the contrast a little bit by adding points in the 3/4 tones and the quarter tones area. You make a subtle S curve by pulling up, right, on the quarter tones and down on the 3/4 tones, and that increases the contrast. But curves, more specifically, are composed, each point on the curve is composed of an input and an output point. And another way to say this is that if you're choosing how to adjust the grayscale of the original image, that's the input points, and then and we're trying to remap it or adjust it into the final image look, which is the output points. So let me illustrate that here. So I have this curve, I have my image. And so what I've done here is you can see there's a very subtle diagonal line, and that represents the starting point when you make an adjustment level curve. If it's in that perfectly diagonal line, then there's no effect applied to the image. And that's because the other thing to look at is that when you are looking at the curve, there is a grayscale at the bottom and there's a grayscale at the top. And halfway between, right, is going to be the perfect middle gray, which would be at 128. Okay, and so I've made a point right on that line. But so the input point is going to be the x-axis here, but the output point is going to be somewhere else. And that's the remapping that happens. So by default, if I didn't move this curve point, it would be right here in the middle. So the 128 grayscale would be on the y-axis, it would also be right in the middle of the grayscale because this is the output and this is the input. So if we start with the middle gray here, if we hadn't done anything, then we still are at a middle gray for the output. So no effect is applied. But here what I've done is I've pulled this point up. And now my output, rather than being 128, which would be here, is 160. So it's further up. Remember, the top of this at the white end of the gray scale is 255, and the black end is 0, just like in a histogram. So 160 is going to be elevated, and so it's going to be a brighter gray. And so what happens is this image gets brighter than the original I started with. Sorry, I didn't include original picture. That would have been useful. Now, conversely, down at the bottom here, what we have is I have a point that I adjusted from 128 with the middle gray down to 100. So it's pulled downward. And you can see my image the result is darker. And that makes sense because I started at a middle gray and then I actually made it a slightly darker gray. And the other thing we can see is we have 3 points here and the curve goes through them and it curves around. And so I'm not just affecting that middle gray tonality, but I'm affecting all of these places that are shifted off of the original diagonal curve. Any place where there's an original diagonal, I can see a difference between my curve and the original line, then there's been a shift in tonality. And if it's above that line, then it's going to be brighter. If it's below that line, it's going to get darker, okay? So Now, another fundamental idea for controlling tonality with curves is that the more vertical that curve is, the more contrast will be produced. So you can see here on my S curve, I've really pulled these, I pulled this point really low and then pulled this point really high, and I got a very kind of curved. So you can see it's like a lot steeper than the original diagonal 45 degrees. So look at my image and you can see the contrast that results because my shift is happening very quickly over a smaller tonal scale. Conversely, here I've actually pulled up this point, the 3/4 points, I've made it go up and I've pulled the 1/4 point down. So I've actually flattened that curve so that it's not changing as fast as it was. And because of that, it's kind of like an anti-S curve. And you can see the resulting image here. My sun is it's less contrast. And in fact, it's less contrast than the original image. The last thing that is useful on the curve to just know about, well, there's more than that, I shouldn't say the last thing, is that, and we talked about this, but that you can use, if you click on this icon here of the little hand, then when you move your cursor over the image, a little circle will appear on the curve and it relates that part of your image and where it falls on the curve in the tonal range. And I think this is a very helpful thing because A, it can allow you to pinpoint an area you want to make brighter or darker. And so you can click on it. And when you do, it will make a point on the curve for you. And number two, if you want to just get a relationship and understanding between the image and the curve and how they are related, you can see. And so if you go a bright area on your image, you'll see that this circle goes up further up on the line. If you choose a dark area, it'll go down on the line because again, it's related to this grayscale, which we see here on the y-axis and the x-axis. The bright whites are up here. The dark darks are down here by definition. So let's take a look at this inside Photoshop. So I have this image here, right? And we talked about just, again, increasing this 1/4 points, decreasing my 3/4 points. Then I get increased contrast, right? That's before, that's after. If I do what I did before where I took this point, which is 128, you can see, and 128, it means that there's no change. I started with the level gray at 128 and I ended with it. But if I pull that up to say 160 like I did in the other image, you can see that my image gets brighter. And conversely, if I pull it down or I put in a lower number, it gets darker, right? And that all the things on the curve also are affected. But I can add more and more points to help constrain different parts of my image. So if I wanted to affect more of the darker areas, but not have as much of an effect on the brighter areas, I could add some more, I've added additional points to constrain that. So I can more just play with the shadows, for example. Okay, if I want to get rid of one of these points, I can select it and I can either just drag it off, probably the easiest thing to do, or you can select it and hit the delete key. Now, notice that there's a little points down at the bottom here, and those actually do allow me to take the white points and the black points and adjust them, and I can actually increase those, pull those in, just like in levels, right? Just the same as in levels, right? If I pull in this black point, if I pull in this white point, it allows me to adjust contrast, but from the ends. Now, normally we don't want to do that. And the reason we don't want to do that is because it ends up clipping our information at the ends. And that's one of the reasons why we prefer to use curves to adjust our contrast and not levels like this, right? Because instead of doing it from the ends, I can do it from the quarter tones. And when I do that, then I get a nice curved line here effect rather than being only like pushing in from the sides. So we get a much better result this way, increasing contrast, than we do when we do levels. Now, something else for us to look at, of course, is brightness contrast, right? I could just use this contrast and I can increase the contrast. What's the difference between doing that and using the curve? Well, probably in this case, not a lot, because the way the brightness contrast is doing this is it's using a similar type of format, okay, to increase the contrast. But like I said, as we use this, we can further refine it with more points if necessary. Now, most of the time I'm not using this many points, but sometimes if I want to constrain a part of the curve, I will. Now let's just look at a couple more facets of the use of the curve. Now, I told you about the remapping, and just to prove my point, if I can bring this point up. Now I need to turn the layer on so it affects, but as I bring this point up, you can see that it's getting more, it's like the dark shadows are actually getting brighter. The highlights really haven't, they are changing, but they're not changing as much. But everything is kind of, there's just not a full black. And that's because I'm controlling the maximum black here is now, instead of 255, it's more like 180, right? I could do the same thing with the whites. Now, normally you wouldn't want to do this, but my point is, this is all about remapping. If I bring these to the if I make a horizontal line, what happens is I just lose the image entirely, because now what I've done is I've forced all the tonal range, no matter if it's black or all the way up to white, it's all at the same middle gray value. So I'm remapping the blacks to middle gray. I'm remapping the whites to middle gray. I'm remapping the middle gray to where it was before. It didn't change. But when I do that, I lose my image because I've forced all my pixels to be. Now, if I continue this and I flip these, and I, instead of have this diagonal, but I have this shape diagonal, what I've done is I've reversed my tones. And when I reverse my tonality, I get a negative, right? And so that's why this image looks like a film negative. So I hope some of these distinctions help you understand these differences between curves, levels, and brightness and contrast. Again, we definitely can increase contrast with levels, but it's not as effective because we're end up cropping the edges in order to increase the contrast, which is not a useful tool. And if I contrast brightness, which is a very simple tool, is much better to use for adjusting contrast than levels would be. Now, one last thing about curves is that, just like with levels, we can come in and we can change the individual color channels. Now, I don't usually do this. I would prefer to use the color adjustment layer, color balance layer right here, color balance. But we can actually shift this. And when we pull, like from the midtones down, we can add, I'm reducing the amount of blue because I'm on the blue channel, so it's getting yellow. If I increase the amount of blue in the midtones, I'm getting more blue, so I'm going to make my image cooler. I can do that with the reds just as easily. Increase, going to get more red. Decrease the reds, it's going to get cyan, which is a greenish blue, because that's the opposite of red. So this isn't normally the way I do this, but I just want to show you that you can actually adjust midtones, shadows, and highlights with this tool if you wanted to. So it's a very fundamental tool that can really attach a lot of the tonal effects of your image. It touches almost all the tonal effects of your image. Okay, now I hope you know lots about curves and you feel more comfortable with them.